History Secrets.
One of the most intense debates in modern history revolves around two apparently opposing ideologies: capitalism and communism. For much of the 20th century, these two ideas were presented as absolute enemies. But some analysts suggest a provocative hypothesis. What if this opposition is, in part, a false dialectic? A false dialectic occurs when two positions appear to be opposites, but in practice, they end up serving the same objectives. According to this interpretation, capitalism and communism may be more similar than is generally imagined. The central idea of this hypothesis is simple. Communism would not have emerged only as an enemy of capitalism, but possibly also as an instrument to destroy other systems considered more dangerous to capital. What would those systems be? Some analysts point to four major historical rivals: monarchy, theocracy, nationalism, and even certain aspects of popular democracy. Let us begin with monarchy. In many traditional monarchical systems, political power was concentrated in the figure of the king, and kings often made economic decisions that went against the interests of major accumulators of capital. For example, upon taking power, some monarchs cancelled debts, others redistributed land. These decisions could drastically reduce the influence of economic elites. For this reason, monarchy was not always a natural ally of financial capital. At various moments in history, kings limited the extreme concentration of wealth, and that represented a threat to systems based exclusively on the accumulation of capital. Another system often mentioned is theocracy. In many religious traditions, excessive accumulation of wealth is viewed with suspicion. Various religions value humility, charity, and detachment from material possessions. When religious institutions possess strong political influence, they can limit economic practices considered unjust or morally problematic. In some older European societies, spiritual values carried more weight than the pursuit of wealth. The third element of this analysis is nationalism. Nationalism emphasizes loyalty to the nation, the people, and the territory. But capital, by its nature, seeks mobility. It crosses borders in search of investment opportunities. For global investors, national barriers can represent limitations, because economic interests often operate on an international scale. In this context, ideologies that encourage global identity may facilitate the circulation of capital. The fourth element is more surprising: democracy, especially democracy based on broad popular participation. When large populations possess direct political power, they can demand redistribution of wealth. Progressive taxation, social programs, economic regulations. In other words, strong democracies can pressure economic elites to share resources. For this reason, some analyses suggest that purely capitalist systems are not always comfortable with highly participatory democracies. Within this controversial interpretation, communism would have played an unexpected role. Instead of destroying capitalism, it would have helped eliminate some of these rival structures. For example, communist regimes abolished monarchies. They replaced them with single-party systems, centralized structures that concentrated political power. They also fought religious institutions aggressively. Karl Marx described religion as the opium of the people, an idea that influenced many communist regimes to restrict religious practices. In addition, international communism defended the global unity of workers. The famous phrase, "Workers of the world, unite," reflected an internationalist vision. This reduced the importance of traditional national identities. Another controversial point involves democracy itself. Some communist models argued that the people did not possess sufficient political consciousness. Therefore, a revolutionary vanguard should guide society. In practice, this led to the creation of dominant parties that concentrated political power. If we observe these four elements together, a provocative hypothesis emerges. Capitalism and communism may have shared some structural enemies, and at certain historical moments, both contributed to weakening them. This does not necessarily mean that there was a conscious conspiracy, but it suggests that different ideologies can produce similar effects under certain circumstances. One example often cited in this debate is the life trajectory of Karl Marx. The principal theorist of communism was born in Germany, but spent much of his life in England. Curiously, England was one of the most capitalist societies of the 19th century. Even so, Marx managed to live there for decades, and he wrote much of his work in the library of the British Museum. This fact raises interesting questions. Why did the British authorities allow a revolutionary thinker to write freely in their territory? Why did he not face more severe repression? Another intriguing aspect involves his finances. Marx did not have a stable professional career. His work sold little during his lifetime. Even so, he managed to maintain a relatively comfortable life. Much of this financial support came from Friedrich Engels. Engels was the son of a successful industrialist. His father owned capitalist factories. This raises a curious question. Why would an industrialist finance a thinker who defended revolution against capitalism? This question remains the subject of debate among historians. To better understand this discussion, it is also important to distinguish between two concepts that are often confused: socialism and communism. Classical socialism proposes redistribution of wealth. The goal is to reduce inequalities between social classes, but without necessarily abolishing all private property. In many European countries after World War II, democratic socialist systems emerged: welfare states, public healthcare programs, free education. Communism, on the other hand, in its most radical form, proposes something different: the complete abolition of private ownership of the means of production. The ultimate goal would be a classless society, without rich people, without poor people. This difference produces profound consequences. Under socialism, wealth is redistributed. Under communism, property is eliminated. This completely alters the balance among social classes: the middle class, the rich, and workers. This distinction helps explain why socialism and communism, although they seem similar, can produce very different results, and why debates about these ideologies remain so intense even today. In the end, the false dialectic hypothesis raises an important reflection. Perhaps the history of ideologies is more complex than simple battles between clear enemies. Sometimes systems that appear to be opposites can coexist, can influence one another, and can even produce unexpectedly similar results. If this interpretation is correct, it invites us to look at history more carefully, not only by observing visible conflicts, but also by analyzing the deep structures that shape power in the modern world. To better understand this discussion, it is important to observe how each of these ideologies interprets the evolution of society. Classical socialist theory starts from a relatively simple idea: society changes gradually, as its economic structures evolve. For centuries, many regions lived under feudal systems. In those systems, land was the main source of wealth. The aristocracy controlled the territory, and most of the population worked as peasants. With the advance of the Industrial Revolution, this structure began to change. Land ceased to be the main means of production. Factories, machines, and industries became central to the economy. This new system created two major social classes: On one side, the capitalists, owners of factories, equipment, and financial capital. On the other side, the workers, people who depended on selling their labor in order to survive. According to many socialist thinkers, this system would inevitably produce tensions. Because capital tends to concentrate over time. Larger companies absorb smaller companies. Markets consolidate. At first, there may be thousands of capitalists competing with one another. But over time, only a few remain dominant. This process creates ever greater inequalities. Meanwhile, the working class grows. And with urban and industrial growth, workers begin to organize. Unions emerge. Political movements gain strength. In democratic systems, these workers can use the vote to promote change. They can demand labor rights. They can demand better wages. They can demand redistribution of wealth. It is at this point that the concept of democratic socialism emerges, a system in which public policies seek to reduce social inequalities. Welfare programs, public education, universal healthcare. After World War II, many European countries adopted models close to this idea. They did not abandon capitalism, but they created robust systems of social protection. This model produced decades of stability and economic growth. Many people came to believe that this path represented a natural evolution of industrial society. However, Karl Marx had a different view. For Marx, this gradual process would not be enough. He believed that the capitalist system possessed powerful mechanisms of self-preservation. According to Marx, economic elites control fundamental institutions, schools, media, culture. These institutions would shape the way people understand the world. He called this phenomenon false consciousness, a situation in which workers do not fully perceive their own interests, because their ideas have been shaped by the existing structures of power. Within this logic, gradual transformation would be almost impossible, because elites would always find ways to preserve their privileges. For that reason, Marx defended something more radical, a revolution, an abrupt break with the existing system. This revolution would destroy the structures that sustain capitalism, private ownership of the means of production, class hierarchies, institutions that reinforce inequalities. But for this revolution to occur, Marx believed a process of consciousness raising would be necessary. Workers would need to realize that they are part of the same class, a global class. This idea led to the concept of proletarian internationalism, the notion that workers from different countries share the same interests and should unite beyond national borders. This view contrasted sharply with traditional nationalism, which emphasizes loyalty to the nation, culture, and historical identity. For Marx, those identities could distract workers from the real struggle between social classes. At this point, the fundamental difference between socialism and communism emerges. Socialism seeks to redistribute wealth. It accepts that some forms of private property may continue to exist. Communism, by contrast, seeks to completely eliminate private ownership of the means of production. The entire economy would be organized collectively. In theory, this would lead to a classless society. But this transformation would have profound consequences. Without private property, both the rich and the middle class would lose economic status. This would create new tensions, because classes that previously possessed privileges could resist this new system. In practice, many communist regimes faced exactly this type of conflict. This difference explains why socialism and communism, despite sharing some ideas, produce very different political structures. One seeks to reform the system. The other seeks to replace it completely. Returning to the false dialectic hypothesis, some analysts observe something curious. When communist revolutions occur, they often destroy traditional institutions, religion, aristocracy, ancient national identities. But after decades of transformation, many of these societies end up reintroducing capitalist elements. China is often cited as an example. After intense periods of ideological revolution, the country adopted economic reforms that opened space for markets and private investment. Today, the Chinese economy is one of the most dynamic on the planet, combining centralized political structures with highly competitive economic practices. This type of evolution raises once again the original question: are communism and capitalism really absolute opposites? Or is it possible that, in certain historical contexts, they end up interacting in unexpected ways? Perhaps the answer is more complex than any isolated theory can explain. Ideologies rarely remain pure over time. They transform. They adapt. They mix with other ideas. And so, the political history of the modern world continues to evolve. Between economic systems, between structures of power, and between different visions of the future of human society. The search to understand the past has always been part of the human journey. We explore ruins, decipher ancient inscriptions, and investigate forgotten accounts. Each discovery expands our understanding of the civilizations that came before us. But it also reveals new questions. Questions that continue to drive our curiosity. Because history is not just a record of the past. It is a continuous path of discovery. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.